Hello, my name's Steve King. I'm an Art Society lecturer and my specialist subject is music. Music actually really since 1960. I specialise in 60s, 70s and 80s, but I do wander into the 90s and the music of today.
And my name is Scott Schiavone. I am also a lecturer for the Art Society, but I am a fashion historian and curator. I specialise in 19th and 20th century French, British and American women's wear and the rise of the superstar designer, but also marginalised histories such as LGBTQ plus designers and black designers, etc. Especially centred around the 1970s and New York and the disco scene, designers such as Halston and clubs such as Studio 54.
I think it's a really important era in music history. It is when music and fashion did seem to come together quite regularly, but it's an important era in music history because the 60s was about pop and rock, really, and singles. Yeah. Whereas the 70s was about everything. We had all sorts of genres explode at various points during the 70s.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about the singles, it was also about the albums. So, a phenomenal amount of music was produced in the 70s. I would say more than any other decade.
Yeah.
It's down quite a bit now from what we used to get then. But yeah, I haven't got the numbers on that.
Yeah. And I think in terms of fashion, the 60s was all about rebellion. The miniskirt and designers like Mary Quant, those British designers, Jean Muir. And then the 70s, I think, was more about hedonism and flamboyance. I think we'd gone, moved away, although disco fashion is very much rooted in rebellion as well.
Yeah.
But it was a beautiful era of fashion, flowing gowns. And it was Barrie White, actually, who said that disco is a beautiful art form because it makes the consumer beautiful. And I love that quote because it kind of connects fashion and music together in that simple phrase. So yeah.
And he was right at the forefront of the development of disco. I mean, disco really began with a song by George McCrae called Rock You Baby, which was released in 1974. And it was, there were other songs that you could say were disco songs before that, but that was the one that was the big international hit.
Yeah.
It went to number one everywhere, so it really put it out there into the mainstream. And that was a sort of a new sound, a sort of lilting. It was written by KC of KC and the Sunshine Band. It was kind of lilting, sort of easy to dance to sound, which was a kind of a hallmark of disco, really. It was meant to be relatively easy so that anybody could dance to it, even if, like me, you couldn't dance at all and you had no sense of rhythm. You could still get away on the dance floor dancing to that one. That started it, and then quite quickly after that, Barrie White got involved with his own he had his own orchestra. This was new, the Love Unlimited Orchestra was Barrie White's orchestra, effectively.
Yeah.
An orchestration came to disco with him in sort of 73, 74. So, it's all the early part of disco was all starting to come together then.
Talking about 1973, that year in particular, there was a famous fashion show that took place at the Palace of Versailles in France, and it was there. It took people from all across Europe, like aristocracy and big head honchos of fashion, etc., were all invited to the palace to raise money for the restoration. And what they did, it was the brainchild of Eleanor Lambert, who was a magazine editor based in New York. And it was 5 French designers pitted against 5 American designers. And Halston was one of those designers, from the American side, along with Stephen Burrows, Anne Klein, Oscar de la Renta, and Bill Blass. And funnily enough, Barrie White provided the soundtrack to their particular segment of the fashion show, along with Liza Minnelli. So yeah, that's a good connection.
The curious fact I have about Barrie White is he was in jail, I think.
Oh wow.
And he heard Elvis Presley's song "It's Now or Never," and apparently that was the inspiration for him to turn his life around, get out there and do something different.
Well, it worked,
and it worked spectacularly. He worked his way up in the 60s and became a major star, particularly in the early 70s, but generally you could say throughout the 70s, and he continued to be successful in the 80s.
Amazing.
But disco, let's just talk about the start of disco, because that came out of really a little bit like punk, a dissatisfaction with what was happening. There were certain groups that felt excluded. Rock was about white usually British American artists, guitar based, and there were a lot of groups, particularly in America, and it all started in New York and Philadelphia in parties. Hispanics, Italians, they also were felt disenfranchised. Women, black people.
Yep.
And, you know, if you look at disco, they started to have parties, and then they started to sort of invade clubs and set up their own scenes. And most of the disco music was actually produced by black artists or women or members of the LGBTQ community.
Plus. Yeah, that's right.
A plus community. I was never going to get that right, was I? And that's how it kind of started and continued. There's very, very little white male involvement in disco, apart from the Bee Gees, who almost got into it by accident. They used to sing sort of fairly mournful, fairly sad songs in close harmony in the 60s, but, you know, by a complete accident, because Robert Stigwood was their manager, actually, and he was producing a film called Saturday Night Fever, and he had to have some music for this film that he got the rights to. And as he managed the Bee Gees, he rang them up and said, "Give me everything you've got." And they just happened to have all these songs, which they sent along: Night Fever, Staying Alive, More Than a Woman. The whole Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, in fact, or the majority of it, came in from the Bee Gees, and that was how they got involved in disco. They never set out to be involved in disco, but they got involved. But just about everybody else involved in disco was not a white male, which was, you know, it was a real opportunity for other artists and musicians to express themselves.
And that's interesting as well, because in terms of fashion, especially in New York, a lot of the designers who were active around the time as well were also black men, but are often forgotten or marginalised through history. And we tend to focus on designers like Halston because of, you know, the whole superstar kind of persona and, you know, those kind of movie star good looks kind of thing. But in actual fact, we had designers like Stephen Burrows and Scott Barrie, who were black men, active, LGBTQ plus black men actually, active in New York, designing for bodies that were meant to be, you know, moving. And a journalist once said that a Stephen Burrows dress was not designed to be stood up against a wall in. It was designed to dance in, you know. And all these kind of like fluid bias cut jerseys and silks and stuff, you know, that Scott Barrie and Stephen Burrows were using. They clung to the body. The bias cut helped with that flow and that movement, you know. And it meant that when you got on the dance floor, not only did it keep you cool, but it also clung to your body as you kind of like moved and all that. And it was this kind of like, it created this kind of ethereal kind of effect on the dance floor, as these kind of like swathes of jersey and chiffon kind of swirling around the body.
Studio 54 style.
Yes, indeed. Yeah,
which was a big club in New York.
Also, another designer that kind of defined that era, who was actually female, was Diane von Fürstenberg, who invented, whatever you want to say, the wrap dress, which was launched in 1973. Now, I'm pretty sure that there would have been many versions of the wrap dress in the high street stores.
I remember it. I definitely remember that. I want to talk a bit about Donna Summer, because Donna Summer as an artist was arguably the biggest disco artist. If you look at the range of hits that she had in the 1970s, obviously she went on and had hits in the 80s and 90s as well. But Donna Summer released a record in 1976 or 5, it might have been 5, called "I Feel Love."
Oh, of course, yeah.
And it was it was a game changer. Yeah. It was entirely musically, it was just Moog synthesizer. I think the first track that was entirely created on a Moog synthesizer. It's a very hard, heavy, fast dance track to which they'd put words in, and Donna Summer worked out how to sing. It's not an easy song to sing, actually.
An amazing song to dance to, though.
Yeah, it's an amazing song to dance to. But that was a game changer. This was a completely new sound. And Brian Eno of Roxy Music, well, formerly of Roxy Music, he was working with David Bowie at the time. And he phoned up Bowie, allegedly, and said, "I have just heard the future."
Yeah.
And he was right, because the whole electronic dance movement started there. Not just dance. I mean, you know, it spread into the 80s, the electronic 80s, we call it now. That was kind of the beginning of that.
And that pulsing beat of that song is what would have fueled the body movements that inhabited these kind of like, swirling, beautiful dresses that were being worn on the dance floor of the discotheques.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely.
Because you can't help but move your body when you hear that song.
Shall we move on to punk? I said it's a little like disco. This was a rebellion in music. It was a real two fingers, if you like, to the existing music industry. What had happened was that, the big artists had become very rich, superstars like Elton John, groups like Led Zeppelin, Rod Stewart, other people like that. They'd all become, very, very rich. They'd become the world's first superstars, if you like, in music. And the youth of the day, the last wave of the baby boomers or the new teenagers felt very distant from them. They didn't feel they represented their lives at all. And they become a bit disenfranchised with the way the record industry was working as well. So this whole back to basics approach that punk gave us, 3 guitars and a set of drums, which was really right back to rock and roll, I suppose, where you could perform it in nightclubs. It was energetic, it was loud, and you could throw yourself around the dance floor to it. That all really came as a bit of a reaction to these big stars that were too far from them.
Yeah. Fashion definitely, in terms of punk, came from exactly the same place, that place of rebellion. And the whole kind of punk aesthetic was almost kind of, invented by Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood, of course, probably one of the greatest British designers to have ever lived. She was born in Cheshire, and she was a school teacher, actually, a primary school teacher, and married quite young, made her own wedding dress, and then met Malcolm McLaren, and that's when she left her husband and moved to London and had a flat in Clapham. And the whole kind of punk aesthetic came from Malcolm McLaren managing the Sex Pistols. And of course, then they needed a look to go along with the sound. And that was where Vivienne stood in and started designing these really rebellious clothes that were shocking. They were really shocking. And Vivienne said herself, I'm not quoting her verbatim, but basically what she said was that she wanted to throw like a spoke in the wheels, or a spanner in the spoke of the wheels or something of the establishment.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what punk was. And the amazing thing about punk as well is that anybody could be punk because it was so accessible, because it was DIY.
Yeah.
You could make it yourself. You could rip a T-shirt. You could get safety pins from your mum's sewing box.
People wore bin liners.
Exactly, yeah. And of course, that kind of was manifested in the store that McLaren and Westwood had on the King's Road, which opened in the early 70s, where it was called Let It Rock when it first opened, and that kind of had a teddy boy aesthetic, and it dressed the kind of teddy boys of London. And then it kind of moved through various iterations. After Let It Rock, it was Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die, which was based around James Dean. And then, of course, there was Sex, which was then based around this kind of punk aesthetic, rubber clothes. And then it moved into seditionaries, and seditionaries was really when the kind of punk aesthetic really took hold. But most of these designs were actually done in Vivienne's kitchen and were made. She would boil up chicken bones, and she would sew them to T-shirts and rip T-shirts apart and put them together again with safety pins. And it was all done in our little flat in Clapham.
Wow.
And it was just this kind of like, it was that kind of right time, right place. It was capturing the zeitgeist and really kind of channeling that disillusionment that you mentioned before in music. So I think that in terms of punk, fashion and music they're like intrinsically kind of linked.
Very much
they
so.
Really are.
Yeah. And it wasn't just music, the music business they were disillusioned with. They were disillusioned with everything. I mean, I think
that's right.
They were disillusioned with their lives. The Sex Pistols song, God Save the Queen, ends with a repeat of "There's no future, no future, no future for you." And it was pretty grim, some of the stuff they were singing about. I mean, London Calling by The Clash is about all the different ways the world could end. The 70s economically in the UK was a bit of a disaster. I mean, we had 3-day weeks, we had power cuts. The youth of the day were experiencing a difficult time trying to get work. So, in a way, the lyrics of the songs reflected, a lot of them anyway, reflected what was happening with punk. I once wrote a punk song.
Wow.
I wrote, it was in 1977, I was in the Isle of Wight doing the summer season. I was in the nightclub and there was a band playing in the kind of bar next to me. And we got quite friendly. And I wrote, I couldn't write music, but I wrote the lyrics out poem style.
Yeah.
And I gave it to the lead singer and said, what do you think? He said, well, we'll try it. And so he wrote the music and they used to play it. Apparently it was quite popular.
Oh, wow.
They used to play it every night for a summer season. I mean,
yeah.
it was never...
I do remember a short period during the early noughties where, in terms of fashion, ripped, bleached jeans came back in, and I used to tear up T-shirts and put them together again with safety pins and wear them with bleached jeans. So yeah, I have made my own punk fashion as well. Just not in the 70s. I wasn't born then, unfortunately.
I was very much there, so I saw it all happen. And punk had two waves. I mean, the first wave was the real shock wave where people went, whoa, what is this? What's going on here? And it worried the establishment, as these kind of things always do. What's going to happen here? Because it was very, very rebellious. And then you have a kind of second wave, or a new wave, it was often called.
And is that connected to the New Romantics?
Well, not really. It was more about a new wave of artists, a second wave of punk artists coming through, a little bit more sophisticated, and a record company having a little bit more control in what was going on. And in that category, you can put Blondie. Yeah. For sure, and the Police would have been two of those acts that came through in the second wave.
Who had a disco hit with Heart of Glass?
She did it, yeah.
Well,
and that's the other funny thing. Just linking back to disco, that disco became so ubiquitous in the late 1970s that everybody felt they had to make a disco track.
Yeah.
The Rolling Stones made one called "Miss You."
Yeah.
Rod Stewart made one called "Do You Think I'm Sexy," which he still sings at 80, whatever he is.
He does indeed, yeah. He just recently performed at Glastonbury, didn't he?
He did, yeah, he did.
I don't know if he sang that song though.
I think he did.
He probably did.
Yeah, I think it was part of the set. I did see the set, but I think he probably because he usually tells some joke about it.
Yeah, I did hear an interview with him and Joe Wiley, and he was saying that he felt uncomfortable on stage during Glastonbury because his pants were too tight. I thought, okay.
Even though the punk was a reaction to these people like Rod and Elton John, they still continued to have hits throughout the remainder of the 1970s. It didn't go away. It's just that punk gave us this wonderful explosion of new acts,
and it was so different as well. Yeah, both rooted in rebellion, but so different in terms of sound and aesthetic, and
we got Elvis Costello, we got Squeeze and Jules Holland. Obviously there's a Clash, we've mentioned them before, but and Stranglers and people like that. Really a real explosion of talent. Which in a way kind of led to the New Romantics, which is a flipping back a bit to sort of the more glamorous side of...
Who Vivienne Westwood also helped shape in terms of their kind of visual aesthetic with Adam and the Ants.
Yeah, and Duran Duran.
Yeah.
And I suppose you put Spandau Ballet in that same category. So it kind of all led on from that.
Excellent.
In the early 70s, we had something called glam rock.
Yes, indeed.
That's quite interesting because, that was really... It was Marc Bolan and T-Rex that started the whole glam rock thing, allegedly because just before he went on for a Top of the Pops performance, somebody put a couple of glitter teardrops on his cheeks and a little bit of makeup on, and he went out and performed on Top of the Pops, and that, they say, was the start of glam rock. Lots of people are arguing about whose idea it was to do that, but that's supposedly where it started. And Bolan, who and there were many glam rock bands, but Bolan saw himself as a dandy. In fact, he was a great admirer of Lord Byron, one of the original romantic sort of dandies. Yeah. And that is quite a theme throughout pop history, isn't it? Sort of dandyism.
Of course it is, yeah. And it originates, so dandyism kind of originates in the late 18th, early 19th century. And of course, the most famous dandy is Beau Brummel. And he famously said, don't talk about your clothes, let the clothes do the talking. And that the whole kind of idea of dandyism came from a movement, a shift. It was, again, rooted in rebellion. but it was a movement and shift towards refinement and towards taste and cut and construction and clothing. And it was a huge pare down from what had happened before in the 18th century, where, you know, men would have extravagant embroideries and wear colours like pink and yellow and green, and, you know, it was all very extravagant, and makeup and jewels and high heels, etc., etc. And then there was this thing that happened called the Great Male Renunciation, and this is where men kind of abandoned these kind of notions and these what they called effeminacies. They abandoned these kind of like extravagant, flamboyant clothes,
right?
And it came all down to this kind of idea of refinement, and it was a rebellion against that, you know. And dandyism has continued throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century as well. In the 60s, you had the peacocks.
Yes.
You know, the men who dressed themselves on Carnaby Road, Mr. Fish, those kind of brands on Carnaby Street, sorry.
Dedicated follower of fashion,
yes,
to quote the Kinks song.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And dandyism is alive today as well. The Met Gala, so the Costume Institute in New York, their big exhibition this year was called Superfine, and that was looking specifically at black dandyism throughout history from the 18th century to the present day. Black dandyism in particular grew out of Harlem in the 1920s, and it was again about rebellion, but it wasn't just about, you know, fine clothes. It was about identity, and it was about occupying space in the world, which, you know, up until this point had been denied to a lot of black people.
Would you put Jimi Hendrix in there as a
I would say Jimi Hendrix was a peacock, I would say, right, looking at his kind of style. Yeah, the kind of velvet blazers, the flares, the, you know, the scarf wrapped around his head and stuff. I would say that was more kind of peacock.
And just to take it back to glam rock, because, you know, it became much more. It became a really big thing in music in the early 70s. You had T-Rex, you had Sweet, you had Slade, you had Mud, and then the more sophisticated version came from David Bowie and Roxy music. So it really became quite a big scene, but not so much reflected in fashion.
It seemed to, from what I can see from glam rock, is it seemed to have borrowed from a lot of different kind of fashion trends throughout the period. You know, you had the kind of glitter and the sparkles, the flares, the platform boots, which all came from disco. But then you had, you know, the jumpsuits with the low kind of scoop necks that revealed navels and stuff, which obviously came from rock.
Yeah.
You know, so it seemed to have borrowed from a lot of different fashion pots. It was kind of like a melting pot in terms of fashion.
And the thing I'm always asked is, was it about the look? You know, was it really all about the look and not so much a genre of music?
I think it was quite performative, wasn't it? Yeah.
I would say, yeah. I mean, it's a very broad genre of music if you think about those artists. I mean, I suppose you can say, you know, the early stuff, the Bolan stuff, the Sweet and Slade, they didn't take themselves too seriously, didn't think the music should be taken too seriously. It was glammy pop, and it was quite exciting. But you can't say it was, you know, if you heard a record today, you couldn't say, oh, that's a glam rock, because there isn't really a genre there.
That's true.
It's just there's just too many different, you know, sort of types of music involved. Everything from rock and roll to kind of Ziggy Stardust and David Bowie and his spacey glam.
I mean, you know, Bowie in himself is a, you know, fashion icon, really, isn't he?
Yeah, and he is famous for one of the most iconic album covers of the 1970s, because suddenly they came to the fore. They were making more money from albums than singles, probably for the first time, certainly late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah.
And Bowie has that famous cover of Aladdin Sane with the sort of red lightning streak across his forehead and over his eye.
Yeah.
And that was one of the examples of the album cover becoming a work of art in its own right.
Yeah.
In the 60s, you just took a photograph of the band and slapped it on the cover of the album, really, didn't you?
Yeah.
Or various different photographs of the band. But by the 70s, people were thinking slightly differently about it. And we had progressive rock, which basically there were album-focused bands experimenting with longer compositions and different types of instrumentation. And they produced, you know, some great album covers as well. The probably the most famous is Dark Side of the Moon, Pink Floyd, with the, you know, the prism on it. But you also had physical graffiti. So albums, you know, that became, you know, a work of art in itself. You know, the album art, as it's called. It is called album art now. The album covers were that came to the fore for the first time in the 70s, as I remember it too. And of course that, you know, was influenced to a certain extent by fashion and what was going on.
Of course, because they had to look good on the front of their album cover, yeah. And wasn't there a David Bowie album cover that featured Twiggy on the front of it?
It was Pin-Ups.
Right.
I think it was Pin-Ups. I could be wrong on that, because I know there's two of them on there. It might be his wife, but I think it could be. Lulu was certainly involved with David Bowie as well for a while. Okay. That she did a version of Man Who Sold the World.
Right.
But I'd need to check whether it might have been Pin-Ups, or it could have been David and Angie on the front of that. That was David Bowie's cover album. It's an album of covers.
Right.
I always think when people release an album of covers, they're fulfilling a record company contract to get something out there into the market quickly while they work on their next major project. But Pin-Ups was actually quite good. I had it, and I was actually quite impressed with Pin-Ups. One of the albums I actually went out and bought. The other thing that I remember, again, I was 14 by this time in 1970. I was 14, and so I went to school then. And the big thing when I was going to sort of school around that time was skinheads and suede heads, as they were called, and they were very particular about what they wore.
Particular brands, the Crombie coat, of course, the donkey boots, turn-ups on their jeans had to be particular lengths. There had to be a certain amount of holes that they wore in their boots, but then also with the turn-up and the boots together, there was a certain amount of holes that had to be visible and a certain amount of holes that had to be covered by the turn-up of the jean.
Really?
It was meticulous. I
remember really it being meticulous, but not that meticulous.
It was.
And they were very specific about the types of music they like as well.
Yeah.
It was Motown, reggae, some of the early reggae stuff, ska to some extent.
Because it came out with the mod movement.
It did. They came out with the mod, but they just shaved their heads. And then if you were a suede head, you were allowed to have hair that was a little bit longer.
That's right,
but not very long.
Yeah.
So I remember it. The girls too. Everyone just cropped it right down. I think there were more girl suede heads than there were skinheads, but certainly it was a major force. Then out of that sort of style of music, particularly the Motown style of music, we had something called Northern Soul in the UK emerged, which was, in terms of music, it was mostly American soul music that hadn't really been a hit, but just had the right sort of beat for Northern Soul fans to dance to.
It was quite particular in terms of fashion as well. Northern Soul, it was that kind of like Fred Perry button-down polo shirt, the Oxford bags, bowling shoes. But that then kind of evolved because of the nature of dancing involved in Northern Soul and how kind of, vigorous and energetic it was. The kind of uniform, so to speak, evolved into a vest and flares.
Yeah.
Which then became the kind of standard. And then, you could just sweat and dance all night in your vest and flares. Yeah.
The interesting thing about when you did a Northern Soul night, and I did a few, was that you had the whole model for the nightclub changed because Northern Soul fans didn't really drink.
Right.
Because you couldn't drink and throw yourself around like they were doing on the dance floor. You couldn't, so they wanted to go on all night and dance. So there was a high admission price to get you in, and then the DJ
because less was spent behind the bar.
Because less was spent behind the bar. That's just why they did it. They bought Coke and water and things like that.
Yeah.
And they came in with holdalls which had towels in because they spent an awful lot of time on the dance floor. And it wasn't just jogging around. It was
really
backflips and all sorts of things. It's fantastic to watch.
They needed that kind of loose-fitting clothing as well to be able to, throw themselves around the dance floor.
Yeah, it was great to watch that sort of thing, and that was a whole movement, a movement which still exists today.
It does, that's right.
In our village, there is a Northern Soul Sunday afternoon get-together. I think it is now.
It's having a bit of a renaissance, actually. I have to admit. Yeah, there are Northern Soul evenings in London all the time in the East End. Yeah,
I mean, a lot of the Northern Soul stuff was Motown.
Yeah,
but not generally big Motown hits, but the Gloria Jones, Tainted Love was the real rarity in my sort of early years playing Northern Soul music. You couldn't get hold of a copy. Actually, it was quite difficult to get hold of a copy. Funnily enough, she actually became the girlfriend of Marc Bolan. Wow. In later years, but it was material like that, and then it sort of split. And the funny thing about Northern Soul is there was a group that said no, a purist. It's got to be all about 60s soul music that has the right kind of beat. And others said no, it's about any song which has the sort of beat we like. And it split a bit. And this new group went off, and they would they would dance to any song where they felt had the right rhythm. One of which turned out to be the theme tune to the TV series Joe 90.
All right.
So do you think, I mean, what came first? Was it the fashion or the music?
I think it depends on what genre we're talking about here. Okay. I think we mentioned before about punk and how the two of them were kind of intrinsically linked. I think they grew together simultaneously. The look, the sound, I think it evolved. I think with disco and with the other like Northern Soul that we've just discussed, I think the fashion kind of adapted to suit the music, to suit the body movement that went along with the music, to suit the the venue, these kind of hot clubs where people would sweat and stuff and they needed these kind of loose fitting clothing. But I think essentially they're kind of moving hand in hand. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. I don't think one is particularly leading the other. I think maybe with something like glam rock, I think the look was kind of manufactured to because of the music. But then, as you say, the music itself wasn't.
Yeah, I think it definitely came first. Glam rock was held together by the look.
Yes.
It would be not the music necessarily. I mean, the music was great, but it didn't really hang together in a genre. So I would definitely say that. I would also say that again, the skinheads and the suede heads, they seemed. That the fashion seemed to come first, and then they started accumulating the sort of sound they would have.
Yeah, and I guess that all comes down to identity, doesn't it? Identity and tribes and being able to, recognize yourself and find your people.
Yeah,
and finding your people through music and finding your people through fashion. That's what we do naturally as humans, is we try to find our tribes, and I think that fashion and music help us do that. What do you think?
Yeah, no, true. And as a genre, if you like, becomes popular, it splits into other tribes, other versions of that genre. So disco, we had funk, made famous, I think, by Sly Stone, really, that kind of style, but continued throughout the 70s by the early stuff by the Fatback Band and Kool and the Gang.
Yeah.
And so that it went that way. And the other way it went was in something we called jazz funk. And this is really interesting. This is where jazz artists got involved in making music for discotheques.
Yeah.
So you had Weather Report, and a track called Birdland, which is one of the most famous jazz funk hits of the 1970s, and also Herbie Hancock became very involved. So you ended up in the disco with, there was the jazz funk tribe, there was the people who liked pure funk, there was the people that liked straight disco, and you had to kind of keep all those groups happy.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favourite disco songs is He's the Greatest Dancer by Sister Sledge.
Yeah.
And that blatantly links music and fashion together with the immortal line Halston, Gucci, Fiorucci, which was written, I think, by Nile Rodgers of Le Chic. Is that right?
It was a Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards production. Yeah. So the whole Chic thing, which we can't not talk about because it was important at the end of the 70s and important for disco. I mean, they created Les Freaks, Good Times and all that sort of thing, but also all of the Sister Sledge hits were written by Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards. They put them all together. Nile Rodgers, of course, went on to be a pretty famous producer, but it's that guitar, that rapid rhythm style guitar of Nile Rodgers, which makes which links all of that kind of music together. And he later went on to produce for people like David Bowie, Diana Ross, and people like that, and he's still doing it today.
What's interesting though about those three designers that are named in that song, obviously I've mentioned Halston before, who was the king of 70s fashion. Gucci, by this point, didn't really have that much of a following and was kind of seen, it had a presence in New York and of course in Europe as an Italian brand. But it wasn't hitting the same way that these kind of new, fresh designers were. It was a bit kind of stuffy, but it rhymed with Fiorucci. And that's the reason why it was put into the song, because it rhymed with Fiorucci. And what's interesting is that Fiorucci, the store in New York, was actually not really a fashion brand as much as it was a lifestyle kind of brand. They dubbed the Fiorucci store, which was on Madison, I think it was on Madison Avenue in New York, as the Daytime Studio 54. And it's where people, the kind of fashion elite, people who were allowed in to to Studio 54, would kind of hang out during the day. And there's very little, there are kind of key iconic pieces that came from Fiorucci, like PVC skin tight, like pants and things like, when I say pants, I mean trousers. You know, but in actual fact, it was more of a kind of concept than it was a designer, although Fiorucci himself did come from Italy, was a designer kind of thing and set up the store in New York. But it was very much a kind of lifestyle thing.
If we look at today's kind of market, if you like, we would say in the record business, there's still strong elements of disco there, you know, that sort of era. It went out of fashion in the 80s. It went out of, and people didn't want to talk about disco. They'd had so much of it in the 70s, it became a sort of dirty word, and we stopped calling it disco. And even though, you know, dance music continued and developed into hip hop and all that kind of thing, we didn't talk about disco for years and years and years. And then I suppose Kylie Minogue made a song called "Can't Get You Out of My Head" in the sort of early 2000s, had an enormous hit with it. And people started to maybe talk about it again. Yeah. And then Daft Punk did a song with Nile Rodgers called Get Lucky. That's right. Which was really a very close to the disco sound. Yeah. And then we still, and today there are still, I mean, you know, Kylie Minogue made an album called Disco. We got Dua Lipa.
Madonna did Confessions of a Dance Floor, and her whole concept for that album was disco. The look was, you know, leotards, very kind of 70s, flicked out hair, sequin belts, and, you know, that kind of thing. So in many respects,
it's back today. I mean, Dua Lipa, two hits. One was Levitating, very, very disco. Sophie Ellis Bextor is still making...
Well, Steve, you may not have noticed, but I am actually wearing flares today. I am wearing flares today, so the 70s are back.
when I was young, there were the cheaper version. They weren't jeans. They were made out of a cheaper material. They were called loons. Right. And one of my early jobs on a Saturday afternoon was to work in a place called the Gear Shop in Leicester, where we sold these high fashions. And loons were £2 a pair. Yeah. In any number of colours, you know, all the bright colours. And they sat on the hip. Yeah. As opposed to, you know, round your waist.
I remember in the mid to late 90s, the 70s had a bit of a revival as well, and the like flared jeans and tight tops kind of came back into fashion, and I remember like so wanting a pair of flared jeans, but you had to buy them from a vintage store because none of the high street stores stocked them. They did boot cut, but they didn't do flare. So if you wanted flare, you had to go to a proper vintage store, and at the time I could never fit into them because I think men in the 70s were tiny. From what I could see from vintage jeans anyway.
Yeah, the streaky look was made famous by people like Rod Stewart. Yeah. And, you know, that sort of, you know, and Robert
Jutting
Plant,
hips.
of course. From, didn't look as if they had anything to eat for a week sometimes when they got out on stage. But yes, it was that very slim down look. But if we talk about 70s legacy, and it's interesting because I had a look at the album chart this morning before I came down. The current album chart includes, you know, 4 albums by 70s artists. So Fleetwood Mac have got 2 in there. Wow. And Fleetwood Mac had their I mean, I know they started in the 60s, but their big, you know, sort of most successful period was in the 70s. You know, that very famous lineup with Stevie Nicks and Christine McVie, etc. They have 2 albums in the album top 20 at the moment. Yeah. Also, you've got ABBA in there with their greatest hits, and you've got Elton John with his greatest hits, and that's just the top 20. So, you know, a fifth of the top 20 are made up by acts, and when you look at the songs on those albums, they're all 70s songs. So very relevant still today. Yeah. You know, the music that was produced at that time.
Definitely the same in fashion as well. And in menswear, I think especially, there's a real 70s vibe going on at the moment. Lots of trousers, lots of jeans, a lot of the silhouettes are coming out. Kendrick Lamar at the Super Bowl halftime show, he wore flares. Along with a baseball cap and jacket. So it's these elements of the 70s that are definitely trickling into mainstream fashion again and really starting to catch on, which I think is really exciting.
On that note, I think we should bring things to a close. It's been great talking to you, Scott.
Yeah, you too, Steve. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Subscribe for more episodes of Artfully Said, brought to you by the Arts Society.